Hello, everybody, and welcome to another digital service for Encounter Church. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Joel, and we're really glad that you're joining us today. Today, the church starts all over the world a time that we call Advent. And if you grew up maybe in a liturgical church, you probably heard about that before. If you haven't, well, Advent is basically a time of preparation leading up to Christmas. And, in the same way that for some people, like the second that Thanksgiving is over, we start playing Christmas music. Some of you here didn't start doing it like after Halloween. I don't know what's wrong with you, but anyway, we kind of like try to get ready and excited, and we decorate things, and we kind of like get in the spirit of Christmas. Well, the church historically has done something like that. Like Advent is this time of preparation. However, it's a little bit more, I want to say, somber, a bit more serious, right? Because the idea of Advent is in the church is kind of like to get you back to that mindset of the people that were waiting for the Messiah. And the people that were waiting for the Messiah were waiting in times of difficulty, in times of suffering, right? And there's this connection of preparing our hearts for the hope of Christmas, but also preparing our hearts for, what Christians believe, that is the second coming of Jesus, the idea that one day Jesus is going to return and put the world to rights and make everything new. And we cannot like exist in the tension between those two hopes of the first coming of Jesus and the second coming of Jesus. Now, you've been following along with us. We started a few weeks ago a series that we're calling Jesus the One and Only. And for us, it's like a years long exploration of the life and the person of Jesus. And this is like so perfect to connect with the story of Jesus, kind of like getting us ready to the birth of Jesus. So what I want to do is almost like a mini Advent series within the larger series. And I want to take a look at a couple of passages in the Old Testament. Like we've been looking at passages in the New Testament that talk about who Jesus is, before we get into his story. Now I want to look at a couple of prophecies in the Old Testament pointing to the coming of Jesus, pointing to the Messiah, that I think are actually going to help us at least appreciate how people in the first century, particularly Jewish people in the first century, would have thought about Jesus. And my hope is that it also speaks to us and kind of like helps center our hearts in who Jesus is. So with that, I want to read a passage in the book of Isaiah. It's one of the prophecies about the Messiah. This is in Isaiah chapter 11. I'm going to start reading on verse 1. Isaiah chapter 11. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. This is the word of the Lord. One of the most famous terms that Jesus is referred by in the Gospels is the term Son of David. I'm going to show you a couple of passages. That's how the Gospel of Matthew opens up. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, right off the gate. It says, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David." Matthew chapter 9, verse 27. As Jesus went on from there, two blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, son of David." Matthew chapter 12, verse 22. Then they brought him a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute, and Jesus healed him so that he could both talk and see. All the people were astonished and said, "Could this be the son of David?" One final one. Matthew chapter 15, verse 21. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon possessed and suffering terribly." Those are just a couple of verses I picked up from a long list. I could go over and over of how many times the people of Israel, the one of the main ways in which they call Jesus is actually the son of David. Well, where does that idea come from? That idea, in part, comes from the prophecy that we read at the beginning from Isaiah, where it talks about this shoot from the stump of Jesse. Now you're saying, and the first thing you might be thinking, okay, in that prophecy, there's no mention of a son, and there is no mention of David. So how is that connected with the story of Jesus? Now I wanna to explain that to you. I want to take you back to a passage in the Old Testament and talk for a second just about King David. If you're not familiar, King David is the most famous king in the history of Israel. Even if you don't know anything about the history of Israel, you've probably heard about the story of David and Goliath. It's just a part of our vernacular. David is the second king of Israel. The first king is King Saul, and King David comes after him. King David has this kind of like Arthurian tale, which, by the way, you think King Arthur's story, there's connection between him and like how the story of David, right? It is this boy that's just a shepherd, and God chooses him to be king, anoints him to be queen. He rises through the ranks of the Israelite military, becomes one of the most successful military leaders they have, and eventually he becomes the king of Israel. And one of the things that separates him from other kings is that he was devoted to God, even though he was not a perfect man by any means, committed a number of sins and mistakes, and God punished him for those things. He had this passion for God. He loved God. He truly loved God. And he never, in spite of all the things that he did, he never went after other gods. He always stayed faithful to the worship of God. A lot of the Psalms that we read, many of them are attributed to King David. For example, Psalm 23, one of the most famous Psalms, is attributed to King David. We don't know exactly how many he wrote, but the belief is that at least some of the Psalms that we have were written by David. So this is incredibly fascinating, character. And in the imagination of the people of Israel, he's the guy. He's like the best thing they've ever had. Now, halfway through the rule of David, David has gotten to the point that he's kind of like, he's not fighting any battles. He's at peace all over, and he's just resting. And he has this sense of like, he's built parts of Israel. He established the capital of Israel in Jerusalem, and he's built a palace for himself. And if you remember the story of the people of Israel, God's temple, so to speak, wasn't really a temple. It was a tent. The tabernacle is a tent, and up until this point it's still been a tent. And there's a moment that David kind of like feels good, like, I live in this super fancy castle, and God's presence, which, I mean, he knows that God doesn't live in there, but like the Ark of the Covenant that represents the presence of God, and God's just like dwelling in a tent. So he has the idea that he wants to build a temple for God. And the way that works at the time is that, there were these prophets that would kind of like, God would speak to them to then deliver a word to you. So he's talking with one of these prophets, and he says, I think I want to build a temple for God. And God gives a word to this prophet, and he goes and delivers the word to David the next day. And the beginning of the prophet is something along the lines of like God saying, you want to build a house to me? Oh, that's cute. He says like, I'm going to build a house for you. And it's this beautiful prophecy where God kind of like reminds David all the things that he's done for him. And then we get to this section that I want to read you actually, that's part of the prophecy. Since 2 Samuel chapter 7, starting on verse 11, says, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands, but my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. David wants to build a temple for God, and God responds in this incredible way. Just how God showing his generosity. He says like, you want to build a temple for me? I'm actually going to build a dynasty for you. I'm going to establish your descendants as kings of Israel forever. Now, by the time that Jesus comes into the scene, this is not the case. The people of Israel after, you know, after David, he has his son Solomon, but after Solomon, the kingdom of Israel actually split into two different nations: the kingdom of the north and kingdom of the south. Um, the descendants of Solomon keep control of part of the nation, particularly like the province of Judah, where Jerusalem, the capital is, but a lot of the other tribes are controlled by other kings. Eventually, both kingdoms kind of like disappear. Like the Assyrian Empire comes and just like extinguishes the whole even concept of the nation of Israel. Is that, kill everybody and destroy it. Eventually, the kingdom of the empire of Babylon comes and takes Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and takes the people into exile. And eventually, when the people of Israel return to from exile, Israel as a nation is just like a shadow of what it once was, and there's really no kings at that time. They have a governor that's kind of like still like controlled by the emperor, and eventually they experience some times of independence. Eventually, there's a couple of different dynasties of other kings, but they're not connected to the house of David. By the time Jesus shows up, there's a king called Herod, but Herod is not a Jewish king. He's kind of like connected through, intermarriage, but he's not a Jewish king, and he's really like a puppet for the Roman Empire. So you're reading that and you're like, okay, well, what happened with the promise that God made that, there was always going to be somebody from David's, descendants on the throne of Israel? And the answer that we have for that is actually in the story of David's son Solomon. So David dies and Solomon becomes king after him. Solomon becomes famous because he's the wisest king and the most wealthy king that Israel has ever had. And actually, you could say on paper Solomon is more successful as a king than David in terms of how much land he controls, how much wealth he has. It kind of like really like takes everything and like multiplies it to the 10th level. Now, towards the end of King Solomon, something changes in King Solomon's heart. It's like a long passage in First Kings, but basically the gist of the passage is that Solomon does the one thing that David didn't do and that God told everybody never to do, which is to go after other gods. Solomon, to kind of like establish control and alliances with the kingdoms around him, starts marrying people left and right. And that was kind of like how things worked at the time. And all the different women that were like daughters of other kings that he wanted alliances with, that he marries, they are worshiping other gods. And what Solomon starts doing is like, I typically really care for these women. It's like, well, you're worshiping your God. Like, I want to make you feel welcome. So why don't we build an altar to your God in my country? So you have a place to worship. And then he starts worshiping these gods with him. So this guy that knows or should believe that the God of Israel is the one true God, starts worshiping after other gods. That's like the worst thing that you could do for God. But not only that, as a consequence of that, he starts, engaging in practices that are offensive to God. Things like child sacrifice, things like slavery, like all sorts of things that basically takes a nation on the wrong way. And as a consequence of that, God has this confrontation with Solomon. And this is kind of like, I want to just read you the part of that confrontation. This is on First Kings chapter 11, also reading on verse 9. He says, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but I will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So if you're kind of like a Jewish person looking back in your history, when you ask yourself, well, what went wrong? What went wrong with Solomon? Like Solomon, straight after God, and because of that is that eventually, the nation fractured into two different nations, and because of that is that then they were vulnerable to the attacks from outside, and then all of these kings like went after false gods, and God wrote punishment. Like everything that had gone wrong, everything that had all the bad things that happened to Israel, primarily exile and the destruction really of the culture of Israel, are all a consequence of Solomon not being faithful to God in the same way in which David was faithful to God. And what you have to understand is that at that time, like the identity of the nation was incredibly connected to the identity of the king. And there's a reason why we don't have kings anymore, because that's a bad idea, but that's how that worked out. So for the people of Israel, it was almost like, Israel as a nation had gone astray from God because the king had gone astray from God. If the kings had been faithful to God, the kings would have led the nation of Israel in the right way. They saw a direct connection between their fortunes and their sufferings and everything that happened to them and the faithfulness or lack thereof of whoever was on the throne at the time. All this is to mean, like, if you're looking back in history, from a place of exile or after exile, from a place of, just looking at the ruins of what once was your great nation and just wondering, where did we go wrong? The place that you point to is Solomon, like the son of David. The son of David, he messed up the pot. He completely, messed things up for anybody that was coming after him. And it's almost like, if you're looking at that, you're almost like kind of like wishing, like, if there was only a do-over for this, because you also have this idea that God had promised David somebody that would sit on his throne forever. And I'm looking around like, well, there's no even kings anymore. How could that be? Did God lie? And in the midst of this, all these prophecies start emerging about, well, maybe it's not that God lied, but maybe the prophecy is about a different type of son of David. Maybe it's about a son of David that hasn't come yet. Like, it seems like everything is lost. You know what's fascinating about the prophecy in Isaiah that we just read? How does prophecy start? That prophecy starts as, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Now, who's Jesse? Jesse is David's father, by the way. So, like, it's kind of like making this connection. He's talking about David without talking about David. He's saying that the family of Jesse, which David is a descendant of that, he says somebody will come from that lineage. But the language is the stump of Jesse. It's talking about a tree that has been cut down. The prophecy is about the Davidic lineage and dynasty that has been all but extinguished. And says a shoot, like a little branch, little something, is going to come out. It says, from his roots, a branch will bear fruit. The prophecy in Isaiah that we read is about the idea that from this lineage that had lost all of its influence and power, where it seems that everything has been lost, what if we could get a do-over? What if David had another son? And if you read the whole prophecy, it's fascinating, because the prophecy in Isaiah talks about what? It talks about, a ruler that's going to have the Spirit of the Lord on him. He's going to have wisdom and understanding and counsel. Well, in the story of Israel, who is the king that has most wisdom and the most understanding and has the best counsel? It's Solomon. Like, the whole prophecy about, what if we had a do-over from Solomon, except that this king says he's going to love the Lord and love the delight in the fear of the Lord and judge right and, care for the poor and protect the weak. This is fascinating language. Right now, it's in the context of this prophecy then that the writers of the gospel start making this connection between Jesus and the lineage of David. And we see that connection on Matthew chapter 1. So Matthew, and I don't want to read you the whole thing because it would take forever, but notice how there's this straight line. It starts with Abraham to David and then to Jesus. So verse 1 says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Then jump to verse 5. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And then we get to verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So the writer is kind of like placing Jesus in the house of David. Now, there's something important here. Biologically, Jesus is not the son of Joseph. Now, the people at the time don't know that, right? Like everybody sees Jesus as the son of Joseph. So there had to be a sense in which Jesus had to be, recognized as a member of the Davidic lineage. And at that time, people know that Joseph is part of the house of David. That wasn't like an unknown thing. It's just like at that time, that didn't mean anything. It was a carpenter because there was no Davidic lineage in power anymore. But at the same time, if you read, for example, the Gospel of Luke, it also has a genealogy with completely different set of names. And a lot of people read that's like, what's going on here? And one of the theories is that actually the set of names that you find in Luke is the lineage of Mary, that Mary is also a direct descendant of David. So Jesus is both at that time, because it was a patriarchal society, men were the ones that counted, like even though we know that's not true, but like at that time, that's how they thought. So like Jesus needed the legitimacy of being from the house of David, from Joseph, but also the biological legitimacy of actually being a descendant of David. Now, why is this important, right? Couple reasons, right? One is that this is one of the number one, you know, prophecies about the Messiah. The Messiah was going to be a descendant of David. This is the thing that the Jewish people were waiting for. By the way, any sort of like promised king that you've read in any story, right? Like if you're like into Star Wars, the idea of the one that's going to bring balance to the Force, if you're into the Matrix and the one that's Neo, or if you are into like Lord of the Rings and like the king that's going to turn, whatever like fantasy thing that you want to think about, right? This idea of this chosen, boy, or that is going to come and going to have like some sort of like special mythical connection to something. They're all ripping off the Bible. Like everybody's ripping off the story of Jesus. Jesus is like the prototype of the idea of the promised king. And there are two things that are interesting about how this prophecy ends up playing out with Jesus, right? Because on one side, if you think about it, Jesus kind of disappoints the people that are hoping on him as a king. And I don't say that flippantly. What I mean by that is like the promise was that a king would restore the fortunes of Israel, that he would take power and become like the political king that lives in the palace, and that he would expel all of the foreign armies and occupants of Israel, and Israel would become like this independent country. That was kind of like the main core of the promise. And actually, the reason why Jesus gets killed, one of the reasons why Jesus gets killed, is precisely because of this idea that the people of Israel start seeing him as the possible true king of the Jews. Jesus gets persecuted by Herod, and his family has to flee because they think that he is the promised king. If you read kind of like the story of Jesus' crucifixion, the reason that the Jewish leaders give to Pilate to execute Jesus is that Jesus says that he's a king. Pilate asks Jesus if he's a king, and Jesus tells him, "You have said so." But then also Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." And what ends up happening is that Jesus ends up getting crucified. Now, this is where the story of Jesus kind of like takes a turn, right? Like we believe that Jesus didn't stay dead, but Jesus resurrects at the third day. And that idea of Jesus, if you think about the death of Jesus, it's a symbol of an enthronement, right? Like Jesus is given a crown of thorns. If you read one of the stories, it says Jesus is given a robe and Jesus is lifted up. It's all the image of the crowning of a king, except that he's a king that gets killed. And then the other side of that is that he resurrects. And then when he resurrects, the language that the writers of the Bible use about Jesus goes way beyond any human king. It talks about how being him, giving him all authority over everything, of him ascending, so not to the throne of David, but to the right hand of the Father. It is this language and this image of Jesus not just being the king of Israel, but being the king of the universe, the king of everything. It's almost like, on a way, Jesus disappoints the people of Israel because he doesn't right away restore the political independence of Israel. In another way, Jesus is so much better than anything they could have ever imagined. And when we think about Jesus as our king, that's kind of like this tension that we see. We see this prophecy and these stories about the son of David. But our hope And our sense of Jesus as king is not just that Jesus is the descendant of David that one day will rule Israel. It's that Jesus is the king of the universe. And that's how we relate to him as king of all. And our hope is the hope that all of those promises of a king that will restore righteousness and justice and will make everything right, that those promises will come true, that one day the king will return. So when we wait for Jesus. Like the season of Advent is fascinating because in a way we're waiting for Christmas and the story of Christmas and celebrate the birth of Jesus. But in a deeper way, we are waiting. As Christians, our life is a life of Advent. It's a life of waiting for the return of the King, for Jesus to come back and make all things right. Now, I want to take just a couple of minutes to show you one more thing about this whole idea of Jesus being the son of David that I think it's important. Now, we read the passage in Matthew, right? And the passage in Matthew is about the genealogy. And on one side, what Matthew's doing is just basically trying to make this case about Jesus' legitimacy as the son of David, right? But what's fascinating about it is how he chooses to do it. So I don't want to read you the whole passage. I just want to kind of like bring a couple of interesting, you know, parts in here. So verse 2, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, right? Verse 3 says, Judah the father of Perez and Sarah, whose mother was Tamar. Um, Verse 5, Solomon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of King David, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife, Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Abijah the father of Asa, and then eventually we get to Joseph. You know what's interesting about some of the names that I've read you? That the genealogy of Jesus is a genealogy filled of very colorful, interesting characters. He starts talking about Judah and his brothers. It's interesting that he mentions them like that. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers, and what he's really pointing to is the fact of what Judah and his brothers are known for, and what they're known for is for selling Joseph into slavery and lying to his father and telling them that he had died. By the way, that story about Judah the father says the father of Perez and Sarah, whose mother was Tamar. That whole story is a story. It's a weird story about sort of like incest. Like Tamar was the wife of Judah's sons, that one of Judah's sons who died, and it's a whole really just weird, bizarre story. At some point in verse 5, he talks about someone says the father of Boaz, whose mother was what was Rahab. Rahab was a sex worker in Jericho who helps the Jewish spies, and because of that she survives, and then eventually she becomes part of this family. Ruth is not even a Jewish woman. Ruth is a woman from a different lineage, and she had married a Jewish man, and her husband had died, and eventually she ends up becoming a part of the family of Boaz, and ends up becoming the grandmother of David. And when I'm trying to tell you that, and then the most interesting part is that he keeps going. He says, Solomon the father of Solomon, who David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Well, that story is about how David basically takes advantage of Uriah's wife, and they have Solomon, who is kind of like the son of this woman marriage. Uriah ends up being executed because Uriah, his wife, is pregnant. It's a whole deal. Like in this whole story is a story about people making these incredible mistakes, which I think it's part of the point. Because remember, what's kind of like the question that the people of Israel are asking themselves, right? Like at the end of the Old Testament, everything went wrong with Solomon, right? Like what if David had just the wrong son on the throne? Like, what if David had another son? Like, the idea of the son of David is like, what if we had a different king that had come from the lineage of David? Now, you might not be like of a powerful, influential family, and wishing, hey, what if our ancestors, had been different? But But I think that we ask ourselves this question a lot. When I was a kid, this is nothing, not something I'm proud of. When I was a kid, my first year of high school, I went to this school with a lot of very wealthy people. And I hated it. It was the worst year of my life. I was bullied. It was just awful because my family wasn't that wealthy. My dad, worked at the bank. We had like middle class, but it was a bilingual school, and my dad really strongly believed that I should learn English. So he kind of like made like a financial effort to send me there, right? But what I realized as soon as I went to school is I didn't belong there. That there to be accepted, to be welcome, like you had to have the right last name and the right color of skin, and know the right people, and go to the right parties. Like it was just this completely different world of rich people that I honestly didn't belong to. And I remember like this resentment being born in my heart towards my dad, basically for him not being rich like them, which is something that to this day I feel terrible about. Like that, if you're looking at this, I'm really sorry I was such a bad kid. I remember I have this memory of one day saying like, I wish I had been the son of like whoever was the richest person at the time, and I cannot imagine how that must have hurt my dad's heart. But at the core of that, what's there is this idea like, man, I wish my life was different. I think that if somebody before me had made different choices, my life would be different. If my dad had been wealthier, my life would be different. His great grandparents had been wealthier, my life would be different. And just think that a lot of us think like that, don't we? And a lot of us think like that with reason, because things happen in our families that have affected our lives today in terrible ways. Maybe a parent, maybe a mother, an uncle, an aunt, a grandfather, and our families are kind of like marked by the mistakes of these people. And part of us is like, what if they had made different choice? What if they had another son? So sometimes it's our lives, right? Sometimes it's like we've made them mistakes in the past, and we're like, we did everything to be able to go back and like not talk to that person, or not go home with her, or not go home with her that night, or like to say no to that thing, or to like say yes to a thing. Like we live these lives of regret of the past. Like the story of Israel at that point is a story of regret about the past, the longing for a new for another son of David. It's a look back at their history, and mistake after mistake after mistake that had been made, and wishing that people could go back. I sometimes I tell this story from this little classified I read once, from a movie called Safety Not Guaranteed. I don't know if you've ever heard it. It's like the little classified says, wanted somebody to go back in time with me. This is not a joke. And it's PO Box 322, Oakville, California. You get paid after we get back. Must bring your own weapons. Safety not guaranteed. I have only done this once before. And the story is basically like they're running this newspaper, and they run out of space, and they have to put something in the space. So the guy makes up these two fake classified ads. One was like looking for a girlfriend, and the other one was about time travel as a joke. But he uses an actual PO box from a PO box that he had forgotten about. And he's in mind, like, just natural instinct is to put the right thing. The little magazine goes out, and he starts getting tons and tons and tons of letters to his PO box. And some of the letters are kind of like people joking about, yeah, I'm bringing the DeLorean. It's like, they're doing the joke. But then in an interview that he gives, he says this. But many letters came from people who wanted me to correct a past tragedy. Dozens in prison asked me to go back in time and talk them out of committing the crime that put them away. Others, and not a few, were from people who begged me to go back and save a loved one from a tragic death. Those letters were so heartbreaking, I almost couldn't read them, and I felt a certain amount of shame for not anticipating the false hope I placed in so many hearts. The reason I'm reading you the story is because I think that it's part of the same aching that the people of Israel have in the end of the Old Testament before Jesus comes into the scene. Of a looking back at their lives and all of the historical regrets that they have as a nation from the mistakes of other people and from their own mistakes, and all of the suffering that comes from that. And so many of us live like that. And so many of us actually kind of like hold it against God. Like, God, where were you when my dad did this? Where were you when my mom did this? Where were you when our grandparents did this thing that kind of like set our family in this trajectory? Where were you where my ex-husband did this? Where all of these things, like we live with this weight and this longing sometimes for a different life. What if David had another son? What if things were different? And I'll tell you this, I don't know why God allows certain things to happen. I really don't, and I don't have any easy answers to that. But what I'll tell you is this. What's fascinating about this genealogy is that this is the genealogy that Jesus identifies himself with. When God comes into the world, he weaves himself in the story, yes, of this, royal legendary dynasty, which is also a terrible dynasty of terrible people doing terrible things. And that doesn't stop Jesus from identifying himself from it. Jesus joins into the human experience and weaves himself into that story. You see, Jesus doesn't offer to go back in time so it could never happen, but Jesus actually does something maybe even better. Jesus weaves himself into our story and redeems it. Because that same story of suffering and pain and all sorts of violence and all sorts of horrible, terrible sins that happen, that would naturally say it's a story that's going to end also in death and destruction and exile and suffering, becomes now the story of the redemption of the world. Becomes now the story of how Jesus becomes king of the universe. You see that? I don't know why the things that happened to us happen. I don't know why the things our parents did, they did. But the answer that Jesus seems to give to us is not an explanation of why it happened, but it's a joining in solidarity. It's like Jesus saying, listen, now Jesus makes that his story. But that means that Jesus can sit next to us and say, listen, that terrible thing that happened in your family that's affected your life, it happened to me too. It happened in my family too. What if David had another son? You see, the promise of Jesus, the invitation of Jesus, the hope of Jesus, it's not only the hope of, of a coming king that will fix everything, which is the most beautiful hope. By the way, I don't want to minimize it. It's also the particular hope that Jesus wants to weave himself into our stories and redeem them and give them a different future and give them a different ending. The other day I was on Twitter and somebody, it's a pastor, like the husband of a writer, and I was just following him, and he just tweets this thing. He says, like, his wife was talking about Thanksgiving and what's not, and talking about like one of their young children, and he says in his way, he says, like, my brother-in-law said the other day to me, he says, like, I see your son and I imagine that's what you would have been that at that age if you had grown in a healthy, functional family. And then people started like pouring into the comments and saying, yes, like that's my dream, that will be said of my son. It's basically all these parents that grew up in toxic, dysfunctional families whose biggest fear is that they're going to mess up their kids because they didn't know what it was like to have a dad, or they didn't know what it was like to have a mom, or they didn't know what it was like to grow up in a house where there wasn't violence. And they have this longing for a different future, for a different life. What if David had another son? And the hope of Jesus is that Jesus is like, I am going to weave myself into your story, into this story of violence and death and betrayal and sin and brokenness and suffering. And I'm going to make myself a part of that story so that through me, your story can have a better ending. Not only in eternity future, but that you can be changed now, that you wouldn't be condemned to just repeating the mistakes of your parents, that you wouldn't be condemned to just experiencing just the aftermath of somebody else's sin or even of your own sin. That I want to redeem you, I want to clean you, I want to give you a new hope and a new future. What if David had another son? When I hear the cry of the people of Israel saying, Jesus, son of David, what it's saying is like, Jesus, is there a chance that you could fix all that's been wrong with us because of the last son that David had? And my cry out to Jesus, Jesus, can you restore my life? Because I live in the aftermath of the sins of others and of my own sin, and I'm afraid. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how to get out of this cycle. And Jesus joins me in there and offers me hope. So, as we enter into this season, know that that's what you're hoping for. It's not only, the remembrance of the baby, it's the hope of the return of the king that's going to fix everything. That's not going to be the king of Israel, it's going to give you the king of the universe. But also know that what you're hoping for is somebody that's going to step into our story, weave himself into our story, and redeem it and change it and give it a better future and a better ending than we could have ever hoped for. Jesus, the Son of David. Grace and peace be with you.